After attending the APEC conference, President Xi officially started his state visit to Vietnam and Laos. On the first overseas tour in his second term, what is President Xi's agenda and what will he bring to the Asia-Pacific? In his speech during the APEC event, President Xi demonstrated China's attitude and determination towards free trade and multilateralism, which is extremely different from the message President Trump put forward. How will the rest of the organization take on those options? The remaining TPP members couldn't come to an agreement about moving forward due to the hesitation of Canada. What is the right deal for the Canadians, and how is it related to tough NAFTA negotiations? China will invest $160 billion in the U.S. energy sector, 65% of the newly made agreements worth $250 billion. What are China's aims, and how will the shale gas revolution change the global energy market?
President Xi Jinping received a particularly warm welcome upon his arrival in Vietnam, pushing aside any current maritime disputes in favor of a history of friendship and ideology. At APEC, he delivered a speech which expressed a worldview that contrasted sharply with that of U.S. President Donald Trump, fueling debates about China getting closer to the world center stage. This despite the fact that deals worth more than $250 billion were made between China and the United States just before the conference, with two-thirds concentrated in the energy sector. How does the world look at the difference between the two biggest economies? What can we understand from the deals done and the views expressed? And in the wake of the shale gas revolution, what economic and geopolitical ramifications will the major changes in the energy markets lead to? To consider these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the first part of the program by Jiang Wenran, Senior Fellow from the Institute of Asian Research in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. In the second half, when we come back, we shall also speak with Martha Hall Findlay, President of the Canada West Foundation and former Canadian Liberal MP, in our studio. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Wenran, are you surprised that President Xi Jinping was given a red carpet ceremony by his Vietnam counterpart despite all the maritime disputes?
Despite all the hypes about international reporting that somehow China and Vietnam about to go to war. Remember 1 or 2 years ago they said the same about China and the Philippines, and a lot of speculation from international press to say Xi Jinping could not afford to look weak before the 19th Party Congress, and yet here he makes peace with the Philippines in the past year or so, now making
particularly
very
in the case of the Falkland crisis between India and China.
Absolutely. India is another one. Everybody's saying, oh, they might have to show some force. To show he's a strong man, he make compromises and cooperation as the first priority. That's very encouraging. I mean, we don't want to see any conflict, especially regional ones.
Yeah, good diplomacy is badly needed for a rising country like China, whose rapid development does carry global ramifications and the impact. What do you think of the ideological similarities? Do you think that help bring the two countries closer and help ease the tensions?
Well, ideologies shared by China, Vietnam, and Laos, especially in the older days, were strong. I think today, if you look at compare Vietnam and Laos, more so in terms of ideological continuity bounds between the traditional friendship between China and Laos. Probably Vietnam is less so because there were interruptions in between since 1970s. And Vietnam, more than anybody else, probably as a socialist economy-based background now rapidly reforming. You know, the business is everything. I think that is part of the de-ideological process, I think, going on in Vietnam. So the two countries probably can talk about economic and business cooperation rather than going back to old days about solidarity of comrades in arms.
You know, another major issue that has attracted the attention of some of the Chinese observers who follow the rapprochement between Hanoi and Beijing is more competitive democracy has been encouraged within the Vietcong, or Vietnamese Communist Party, to our surprise. Now, what about Laos? President Xi Jinping also visited Laos is a member of the ASEAN bloc.
Laos is a little bit of a different case than Vietnam. It's not as open economically as Vietnam, and Laos, I think, never had really ruptures like what happened between China and Vietnam in recent decades. No South China Sea Island disputes issues, and what I noticed that for welcoming President Xi Jinping, they published his book. Translated into Laos language and published with elaborate ceremony, so you can see a very friendly government in Laos to communicate with China, and then in return, the Chinese, normally Xi Jinping is a world figure. Now everybody's saying how big he is, and yet he goes to smaller countries in the neighborhood like Laos to cement that kind of ties. It says a lot about the style of diplomacy. China wants to have a stable neighborhood. Countries as big as India, as small as Laos, matter to China. So I think that sent positive message, especially in comparison with the bigger player of the United States, what they're doing nowadays under Trump.
Many Chinese observers and even Western critics point out China starts to pay more attention to diplomacy when we come under fire as a result of the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. We are accused of sort of militarizing the South China Sea. But thank you for being with us in the first half of our program. That's Jiang Wenran, Senior Research Fellow with the think tank in Canada, and we've been discussing Chinese diplomacy of Xi Jinping, who took Vietnam as the first overseas leg of his journey following the 19th National Congress. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Sitting next to Wenran Jiang is Madam Martha Hall Findlay, President of the Canada West Foundation and former Canadian Liberal MP. Welcome to Dialogue, Martha.
Thank you.
Remaining members of TPP, which has been rejected by President Trump, want this bloc or regime to continue despite the absence of American leadership, with Canada being the exception when you look at the latest development. So tell us more why your Prime Minister decided to reject the TPP. What's behind the reluctance?
Well, first, I don't think that they've necessarily rejected it. My understanding from the end of the meetings were that there was an agreement in terms of certain concepts, but that more work needed to be done. Certainly at the Canada West Foundation, we've been strongly promoting the concept of a TPP-11, partly because, ironically, Canada and Mexico would do better under the TPP-11 than with the United States. Won't go into all the details, but it's actually a very good opportunity for Canada. So, frankly, many in Canada were a little bit surprised at the hesitation. The sense is that this current government is, and with good intentions, but are very more concerned about what they are referring to as a progressive trade agenda. They want to see issues such as gender equality, human rights, labor protections. They want more of those included in some of these trade deals. So it's not just the TPP. They're saying the same thing in the NAFTA negotiations. At some point when we enter into really detailed negotiations with China, I think Canada at some point has to realize that in the grand scheme of things, we're not that big. We don't have that many people. And our economy is very dependent on trade. And so at some point, it would be very useful for the Canadian negotiators to recognize that although those are important issues, engaging in really thorough economic, more open economic trade is beneficial, and that's the whole point of it, is that it be mutually beneficial.
Martha, I'd like to have your thoughts and Wenran about the possibility that President Trump would go ahead with the bilateral negotiations instead of a multilateral regime such as NAFTA. There's one allegation which needs to be confirmed independently as to whether the White House would abandon Mexico and decide to talk directly with the Canadians. Martha?
Canada's been very consistent that we do not want to, as we say, throw Mexico under the bus. We actually have a number of areas of interest that are similar, and it is important that we maintain those relationships. As I said, even on TPP 11, Canada and Mexico actually both stand to gain in a TPP arrangement without the United States, not just Canada. And so we're very conscious about working together on some of these. Donald Trump is a he prides himself on being a negotiator, a business guy. It's not any secret that his preference is bilateral deals where he can actually isolate different entities and focus one-on-one. He can try, but at some point the rest of the world needs to actually recognize that in some of these other areas the opportunities to do multilateral arrangements are more beneficial.
And your thoughts, Wei?
Well, it's just ironic now we have the United States who, and the Western powers at the end of the Second World War, created the current international system. And now the new U.S. president is openly challenging the system as if they don't belong to here. Rather than doing all the multilateral system they set up historically for past decades, they're going bilateral. Or, in my words, more predatory in any kind of settings. And I think that's a reflection of the systemic decline of the relative power of the United States. Whereas China, in contrast, becoming some kind of a champion of the global multilateralism. China is supposed to be the rising power. It's supposed to challenge the current world order by traditional international relation theories. And now
you guys tend to look at the issue. You guys tend to look at the issue in the game of zero sum. I mean, zero-sum game. That would be very detrimental to have sound understanding and knowledge about what China really wants to achieve. China says we don't want to challenge the primacy of American leadership. What we do is to fine-tune the problematic existing world order by not replacing it, but for example, using the Belt and Road Initiative, which is meant to be more inclusive instead of rejecting emerging markets.
But I think we have to be really careful about separating Donald Trump and perhaps Lighthizer as well from the American business community. So we're certainly sensing in our NAFTA negotiations that the business communities, the agricultural communities, the energy industries, everybody wants NAFTA to stay. All of those people involved, the people on the ground who are actually engaged in the economic activity, understand the benefits of open trade, understand the benefits of NAFTA, and frankly understand the benefits, the opportunities that would have been presented in the TPP for the United States. Donald Trump and certainly Mr. Lighthizer also seems to believe that somehow the Americans can go it alone. But the world has significantly changed in the last number of decades. And at the business level, it's not just the United States sourcing parts or sourcing inputs from another country and perhaps selling finished product to a different country. Everybody is related. The supply chain systems are now so multilateral, where they never were before, that for politically an effort to now go bilateral, it doesn't make sense at the business level. And so we're seeing in the United States huge sectors of the agricultural, huge parts of the agricultural sector are up in arms saying we want NAFTA, we want these trade opportunities to stay. But the auto sector is saying the demands that the White House is putting on the auto sector with Canada make absolutely no sense. And so we're seeing an increasing disconnect between the people who actually engage in trade and the people at the political level. And I totally agree. You know, a few decades ago, the Americans were the ones leading this charge. They should be still, but who knows one day to the next what's happening in the White House?
Mr. Obama said the United States stands ready to lead the world for yet another century, another 100 years. No big deal. President Xi Jinping said we have led the world for centuries. Well, Governor Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, said in an exclusive interview with me, Ray, China was the best and the most powerful economically for 18 centuries out of 20.
Yes.
Having said this, let's look at the issue of shale gas. The world went through several oil shocks, the latest being, I'm afraid, shale gas revolution. How do you assess the impact of shale gas revolution on the Middle East? Because everybody is looking at, wow, the anti-graft campaign in Saudi Arabia, which, however, has to reconsider its economic resilience after surviving the latest oil shock? Because the United States no longer imports so much energy from the Middle East. So what do you think of the economic prospects of Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's not just Saudi Arabia. The impact of the shale gas revolution, well, there are two things. One is the technology that it's allowed, the shale gas revolution. We in Canada feel that too. 25 years ago, the United States was dependent on us for energy. All of our negotiations were very much based on the leverage that we had because the Americans needed our energy. That's not the case anymore. They benefit from it economically, but they don't need us. The other aspect of and the technology allows responses to the market, so responses to the market price much more quickly than perhaps traditional sources. The other factor that is looming large over all of this is that predictions for demand for oil, which Saudi Arabia, of course, is much more dependent on in terms of supply, are going to start going down globally over the next number of decades. Gas, a bit different because of the need to be backfill in terms of other energy supplies, but oil. And so as the demand for oil itself starts to go down, just simply because of the world efforts in terms of climate change, that in itself will have an effect on Saudi Arabia. And I think we're seeing their efforts, totally aside from what's going on politically the last few days, and I think we're all watching with great interest to see what will happen. But overall, from an economic perspective, there's no question Saudi Arabia has to look beyond being so totally reliant on oil.
Despite the hefty arms sales that the Saudi government signed during Trump's visit in the Gulf state, it seems the relationship becomes subtle, more fragile as a result of the U.S. phasing out its reliance on the fossil fuel supplies from the oil-rich Gulf states, GCC, for example. Now, what do you think of the economic prospects of Saudi Arabia? Do you think it will be able to maintain its regional leadership in the competition with the Persian state of Iran?
It is surely working very hard to maintain its not only just the leadership in the Middle East in rivalry with Iran, but most of the Middle Eastern countries, we're talking about petrol states, as we call it, depending very much on the oil price to sustain their government expenditure. If you can look at the chart, most of those countries at the current oil price would not cut it. They will be running a deficit. So therefore, especially for Saudi Arabia, heavily depending on oil exports, so is Russia. So US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, three countries, each producing about 10 million barrels per day, which is about 30% of daily world consumption. Saudis want to keep that market share as much as possible, where the U.S. consumption is stabilizing, but supply is rising continuously. So it will erode, structurally speaking, it will erode the Saudi positions on the market share basis, and that's what they're fighting for at the moment. And Americans doesn't want to mix up. They want the Saudi Aramco, the state-owned national oil companies, to list in New York. Big thing. The fossil fuel is still a big deal. Yes, we are not quite out of it yet, but we're in transition.
Yes, we're in transition.
Canadian is also a very big oil producer. What do you think of the energy revolution? Do you share the same concern with the Saudis about less dependence on the fossil fuel? And what does that mean? For example, let's go back to Saudi Arabia. What does that mean for their industrialization?
Well, the International Energy Agency predictions are that reliance on fossil fuel, and I think we need to make the difference between oil and gas, because gas, there's some predictions that say that the demand for natural gas is going to continue because for all of the other renewable energy sources, whether wind or solar or whatever, we still need natural gas to provide the base load. So interesting predictions in terms of the long-term need for gas. But I think most people are consistent in saying that the long-term demand for oil will peak maybe even 2040, but maybe even earlier than that. And so oil, it's not just a price shock now. More people are actually saying the world is going to demand less and less oil at a certain point. There's still a long time out, no question.
But obviously something dramatic captured the headlines these days, particularly during President Trump's visit to Beijing. a hefty deal worth $250 billion were signed between the two biggest economies. China promised to import millions of tons of liquidized natural gas from the United States, despite the shale gas. What do you think of such a major deal?
Well, among the $250 billion signed, some people say it's a lot of deals put together, but I would say any country would want to settle just for 1/4 of that. It's significant. Among the $250 billion deals, 160 billion were related to energy. The impact for Canada is profound. I've been running the Canada-China annual energy conference since 2004, and we're running this Thursday on the 13th conference. We're really concerned, as you asked Marshall that question. Yes, there are impact on others, players like Russia and Saudi Arabia. U.S. oversupply and continuous growth of supply. One major impact is Canadian oil and gas have no market. 99% plus of Canada's oil and gas export to the United States. We have no other alternatives of exporting, and that's why it's kind of been frustrating for many people who want to have the West Coast access, maybe to ship oil and gas products to China. It's not being done, and now we're being squeezed further. This is even on LNG. We're trying to do LNG long before the United States. Now the United States are signing tens of billions of dollars of potential deals between Sinopec and the state of Alaska. So we're behind, and that concerns about our economic prospects, jobs, and everything.
Will that wreak havoc with the economy?
It's not good. But just to explain, when we say we can't get oil to market, it's because we have no pipeline access to the Pacific Ocean. And although we've tried very hard to get pipeline access to the Pacific Ocean, we have a little bit, but very little, and a little bit of expansion has been approved. But major pipeline projects have not been approved to go ahead, which means that although we produce an awful lot of oil, it all goes south, which is great for the Americans. It's not so good for us because we end up with a price discount because we are a sole source, we're a captive source. So we have only one customer. That affects our price. But our oil still ends up going down to the Gulf Coast. It gets refined and it gets exported, but we haven't the ability to do that directly. But it has always been thus. So our economy doesn't get the benefit of being able to export directly into Asian markets, but we've never had that opportunity. And
so Wenyan, did you follow response from the stock market towards this big deal? $160 billion went to the energy cooperation between the two biggest economies.
That's a huge deal. I can tell you, last fall, when our Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came to China for the fall trade deal, all the deals, MOUs, everything add together, I was on part of that mission. At the end of the day, it was $2 billion. Can you imagine what the Americans are doing with the Chinese, even with the water in between? Some deals may never come through, some may take years to do, but the results of the two biggest economies are there. And so Canada need to be, we're discussing this with Martha prior to the show, that we need to be proactive. But there's an angle about fossil fuels, right? Especially natural gas. Not only the United States, but if Canada, Australia ship more natural gas, LNG product to China, it will replace the coal use in China substantially, and reducing, as a result of CO2 emissions, of the Chinese numbers are sitting at 26% globally of CO2 share, which is the largest.
The Canadian, we understand the importance of the market. We understand that economically that would actually be great if we could, in fact, supply that market, or at least many of us do. The problem that we have now is that we have this conflict between environmentalists and others who say you shouldn't build a pipeline, you shouldn't be pulling fossil fuels out of the earth, very much focused on the overall environmental climate change. Some of us answer, well, yes, but the rest of the world actually needs to use this. Canada should be supplying it. But it isn't a question of not understanding the value of the markets. The problem is a domestic one of really a regulatory environment that is way too restrictive, and an attitude in Canada that seems to be more in tune with climate change worldwide than it is actually enhancing our own economy. We have a very strong domestic challenge going on right now, there's no question.
Pretty clear about the supply side concerning energy market. What about the demand side, the Chinese authorities? What was their response to your proposal that LNG will help enormously clean up our air quality and will help reduce our consumption of fossil fuel like coal, which pollutes so much of our land, air, and water?
Well, everybody sees what the environment, atmosphere, and the air looks like in some of the northern major cities, in Beijing, in Harbin, which is my hometown. I grew up there. Very bad.
I think you guys should travel to New Delhi and let Prime Minister Modi know how important it is to clear up the air. Look at the polluted cities like New Delhi.
Yeah,
but they didn't realize how harmful the hazardous fog could be to the health of the locals.
Because 63% of China's total energy is still coming from burning of coal, and 75% of China's electricity generation still depending on coal. Make no mistakes, Chinese have made it more efficient, much cleaner over the years in burning coal. But still, when you burn coal, vis-a-vis using natural gas to produce electricity or doing other things, there's a huge difference in terms of CO2 emissions. And China also converting large amount of coal into petrochemical feedstocks, methanol, coal to liquid, coal to gas. This process may help to clean the air a little bit.
Thank you so much.
CO2 too big. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your contribution to this meaningful dialogue about the future of energy consumption and the revolution of shale gas, its impact on the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.